Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall Taylor,
And I'm Jim Townsend.
and we're so glad you can join us. On Thursday, December 4th, the Trump administration released its long-awaited national security strategy, sending another round of shockwaves through the transatlantic community. There is much in this strategy to agree with, and the viewpoints are not necessarily new. The national security strategy acknowledges that Europe remains strategically vital to the United States and doubles down on the need for Europe to take more responsibility for its defense. But the strategy on Europe differs in its condemnation of allies, focus on Europe's civilizational erasure, and promise to intervene to, quote, help Europe correct its current trajectory, to say nothing of the lack of reference to the risks that Russia poses to the United States. While the 2017 National Security Strategy explicitly laid out several threats Russia poses to American interests, this one makes little mention of Russia except for calls to restore strategic stability. Many of America's European allies are feeling unsettled and concerned about the national security strategy and what it means for transatlantic relations. So to help us understand the new national security strategy, where it differs from Trump's first strategy and where the through lines are, we're excited to welcome Nadia Shadlow and Rebecca Heinrich to Brussels Sprouts. Nadia and Rebecca, welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very quick introduction. So Nadia Shadlow is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and co-chair of the Hamilton Commission on Securing America's National Security Innovation Base. And Rebecca Heinrich is also a senior fellow at Hudson Institute and the director of its Keystone Defense Initiative. Rebecca, maybe we'll start with you. It's been just a little over a week since the national security strategy dropped. We've all read all of the hot takes out there, but just wanted to get from you where you think we are, what your reaction and views are of the national security strategy.
Great. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. So thank you for the invitation. When the NSS first dropped, immediately I started seeing responses, especially from European capitals, different think tank experts, mostly former officials, immediately expressing alarm, condemnation. I don't think panic is too strong of a word. And I thought to myself, this is going to be one of those times where it's going to be really wise to say very little, take it all in, and then kind of process and then make a decision to what to say publicly. I think for me, as somebody who really looks at, strategy in terms of hard power and our integration with Europe, the importance of the alliance, I immediately looked through the report to find what it said about NATO. And I was pleased. I mean, the document still is very, as you mentioned, it calls Europe a vital national security interest of the United States. And then when you see what it means by, what about it, it's because it kind of lauds Europe in terms of its economic, I think it calls it a quote, like pillar of the global economic, of the global economy, and that it's just vital to the United States, doesn't want it to be at war, et cetera. So and it applauds sort of the 5% of GDP commitment for collective defense. So that was really good. And then I quickly looked over on the Asia piece and was wondering if there's going to be this sort of, we keep hearing about this pivot away from Europe to focus on Asia. That's not in there. There's no sort of pivot to Asia in there. It basically says that Asia is also a vital interest of the United States, and so is the Western Hemisphere, and actually the Middle East is too, and sea lanes, which is there's a lot of continuity there for U.S. engagement in the world and what our geographic interests are. There was some concern that Xi Jinping would pressure Trump to sort of change U.S. policy on Taiwan. There's no change on Taiwan. We do not, as a country, support any change in status by force. And so on the strategy piece, if you can sort of like set aside for a minute the very understandably sort of upsetting condemnation and criticisms of Europeans, even the ones that are true, I think it still sort of is very unsettling to see them so prominently in a national security strategy. But if you can put those aside for a minute, you can still see, I think, a lot of continuity. And over the past week, I think cooler heads are beginning to kind of prevail to see that a lot of that's there. And furthermore, you're now even seeing some US officials kind of clarify that, from their perspective, they see this as not an anti-European document, but a very pro-Europe document, make Europe great again. I saw somebody sort of characterize it. So not that it makes it easier pill to swallow on the other side of the Atlantic, but I do think that as a strategy document, you're still going to see a lot of just continuity on the hard power piece of it.
Great. So Nadia, maybe pick that up. And, you as the author of the national security strategy in the first Trump administration, maybe pick up on that theme Rebecca was talking about, kind of some of the continuity. What do you see as some of the through lines from the last Trump national security strategy? And what do you think are its biggest departures?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. And I would say it was more of an architect because national security strategies involve many inputs, many people, many voices, but you pull them together as an architect more. I think so. First, I just want to say that I agree with my colleague Rebecca. I think it's really important for our European allies and partners to focus on the core substantive issues and define and flesh out those issues. So, for instance, it consistently says to create conditions of stability in Europe. Well, of course, that means the ability to deter Russia. There's an opportunity to define those conditions of stability, right? And Europeans can do that in tandem with the United States. It's deterring Russia. To address China's unfair trade practices, that's an area of cooperation. There's a newspaper report out recently on how, China's doubling down on excess capacity in Europe. It's destroying European industry, continuing to lead to trends. So there are huge issues there, and we should be able to sit down with our European allies and talk about ways to doing that. A Europe, not dominated, and also not dominated by Russia, not dominated by any one power. The strategy says that. So again, it gives Europeans a chance to focus on those things. There tends to be, as Rebecca said, and I experienced it because I was at a big Reagan Defense Conference in California, and many European diplomats came up to me and there was outrage. There was palpable anger and outrage. And, people need to step back and go back and look at all of the statements that many European leaders have said over the years about Trump. This has always been a highly emotional relationship. And that's documentable, right? You can go back and look at the outrage and the criticism from day one, from the day before he was elected and Trump won, through the early years of the Trump presidency. So everyone needs to step back and think about what is in the interests of the alliance. And what is in the interests of the alliance are basically many, if not all, of the objectives identified here. Now, I'm sure there'll be further questions about some of the specific areas about European internal politics, and that was very upsetting to the Europeans. But that's what I'll say for now. I can talk a little bit about similarities. I mean, the documents are obviously organized differently. There's a difference in tone, but fundamentally, this is about defining core American interests based on protection of our homeland. Same Trump 1, Trump 2, based on a sense of confidence about what our nation has to offer. Same Trump 1, Trump 2, peace through strength throughout this document, throughout the first 2017 strategy, and a key pillar of the speech that Secretary Hegseth gave at Reagan. Peace through strength. Force has an important role to play, and also a sense of advancing American influence and how to do that and creating alignments. And that language is also in the 2017 strategy and this one. So thank you.
Yeah, a lot to agree with, but let's get to the departures. And both of you, I think, hinted at this, at the kind of significant focus on the kind of cultural values, the civilizational erasure. I mean, that did occupy quite a significant part of the Europe section of the strategy. And so just curious, and again, in the spirit of helping European colleagues, but I think also Americans, to understand where that came from. Why do you think kind of that focus on kind of intervening to reverse the trajectory of European states, like why was that given such pride of place in this national security strategy?
Yeah, so I can sort of take that. There's a part of this which I, as somebody who didn't have anything to do with the first national security strategy, I can kind of look at it with just sort of an outsider's take, look at both of them and compare and contrast. One of the first things I did, I thought this was so remarkable, is, I mean, the one that Nadia was an architect of, to me, was just a better strategy document. It's just in clear in terms of its logic, because you could clearly define the threats. The threats were clearly defined. It was China, it was Russia, it was North Korea, it was Iran. North Korea was mentioned 32 times in the 2017 National Security Strategy. It's mentioned precisely 0 times in the 2025 National Security Strategy. So what that means, I mean, I think that there can be a temptation to read too much into that.
Yeah.
Again, to Nadia's like wise point, it's just everybody sort of has sort of like, I mean, I heard somebody made the point that like this means this is sort of like, you know multipolarity. China gets Asia, Russia gets Europe, and the US gets Western. Like, that's not in the report. That's not in the report. So then I saw somebody else make the take that this is the US withdrawing from our global commitments and focusing on Western Hemisphere. Like, that's not in there either. If any, and there's not even a shift to Asia. Like I said, there's not even a sort of an Asia pivot that President Obama wanted and Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Bridge Colby wants. That's not even in there either. What is in there is that the U.S. still has core vital interests in these areas, and it's very concerned. Again, this is sort of the philosophical heaviness of the report. It's kind of written more by people whose background is in philosophy, less in military strategy. And what they're concerned about is kind of the EU not permitting various member states to have differing views for their own sovereignty. We just had here at Hudson, Sebastian Gorka here from the National Security Council was talking about it, and he kind of made the point, and I agree with it, that a consistent theme has been a focus on national sovereignty. So to the extent that the EU undermines national sovereignty, it's a problem for the United States in trying to navigate various issues in Europe. Specifically, of course, the one that this administration is most concerned about is free speech right now, or the penalties that the EU puts on American tech companies. And so, from their perspective, from the authors who were heavy-handed on the civilizational piece, they're looking at free speech, they're looking at rule of law, national sovereignty, they're looking at the migrant flows coming in and creating sort of precluding the possibility of assimilation that we're used to in dealing with free societies, democracies. So that's been a long time concern of all conservatives in the United States, sort of conservative Republicans. What's unprecedented here was the amount of airtime it got in the national security strategy.
Yeah, that's precisely what I was just going to follow up on. I mean, again, like, understanding these documents, there's fights over what fits in and the words and the language. And so, like, when you match up your point, Rebecca, with there's a lot that's not in the strategy, right? We don't like label Russia as an adversary. There's no, and this is a point I want to come back to, no discussion of the increasing cooperation between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, which I had heard the Trump administration talk about earlier. But like those types of ideas and issues are not in the strategy. And as you said, there's quite a lot of airtime given to these more civilizational issues. And so it's hard, I think, but like putting on a European hat, to not see that as indicating in many ways that Europe, not that it's an adversary, but that the US faces as many challenges from our European partners as we do from the Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, which get scant attention in the strategy. Nadia?
Yeah, I don't read it as saying we face challenge. I mean, it's. I don't read it as we face more challenges from Europe. I read it as the West needs to be, I mean, that there's a sense of the West in terms of ideology and the way that we think about values that we associate with the West. And we need to pay attention to those because in the past, that element always mattered, right? There was a view of communism that was shared, but also to keep in mind historically, there were debates a lot during the Cold War about Germany's Ostpolitik. I mean, Jim and you would know that well. There were debates at the time about, Germany being too soft on Russia, and there was always this kind of back and forth component of these ideas. Now, I don't think this is a deeply ideological document. I don't think President Trump is ideological. And I think that that's kind of what is at the core also of maybe what bothers some of our European allies, because it's not saying good and bad, good and evil, the language that have been used by American presidents in the past. And so it's discomforting to some Europeans. But I think that if we follow through on virtually all of the kind of action areas identified here, de facto, you're going to have to deal with the axis of aggressors. You're going to have to deal with the problems posed by Russia, by China, by North Korea to achieve the sort of stability and balance of power that is mentioned in the document, and regional balances of power that are mentioned in the document. So I think we should just focus more on the actions. But I do think it's the Europeans have this neuralgic, they do not want to discuss any of these kinds of issues related to the West in a sit down, roll up your sleeves way. It's just outrage. And, I think we need to step back and say, what about this is outrageous to you? What are your systems of law, freedom of speech? What is everything going to look like down the line if yeah? So I think that that's a legitimate conversation to have among allies, and there are probably formats to do that.
Well, thank you both for appearing on the show. It's really a treat to see you all, and Nadia, particularly. It's been a long time since I've seen you, and it's great to have you here as well. So thank you. We know you guys are really busy. Just a comment and then a question. My comment is, I think one of the things, because Nadia, you're right. I've over the past week, I've met with a lot of allies over time, and I think what really sticks in their craw isn't as much the issue as the fact that it's part of a U.S. policy document. Because quietly they'll say yes, there are differences in how some of these countries are handling these problems of extremism, et cetera, et cetera. And I've seen some interesting comments where they've admitted to, yeah, we're wrestling with this now. But I think what really upset them was that all of a sudden this problem within the family was put into a policy document and made public, and I think that's one thing that they're kind of insulted that we would talk about it. But we'll see where that goes. But my question for you all is, over the past couple of days, Reuters reported this that there was a long version of this, and that in this long version there was talk about pulling some of the EU members out of, kind of separating them a bit from the EU. I think it was Austria, Italy, Hungary, that there might be some leverage there for the U.S. to kind of coax them, not out of the EU, but coax them closer to us in some fashion. And also was it the C4 or a C5 group? C5.
Hi. Yeah.
And so, but I can't tell if this is really a thing, or if this is Russian misinformation, or something else. It was just hard to tell because this all just come from Reuters, and I haven't, at least I haven't been online over the past 24 hours, but I haven't seen anyone else say yes, I've seen this document. Or was it Defense News? Maybe it was Defense News that reported it. But anyway, I was wondering, have you guys heard anything more? And is there a longer version? And do those ideas about pulling some of the EU members away, or a C5, that in fact that is actually being talked about?
So I'll just take that one first. The quick answer is I don't know. I also haven't seen it. And again, having lived through the first Trump administration, I know, I know not to take some sort of initial reporting as reality. And so I'm going to wait and see. The next thing that I'm looking for, obviously, is the national defense strategy, which, and it's kind of pulling on the thread that Nadia already kind of raised too, with Secretary Hegseth at the Reagan Forum, which was right after the release of the national security strategy. I was really eager to hear what he had to say, to see if there was any clues that changed what we've been hearing about U.S. defense strategy. And again, I got some, signals that a lot of this is going to be, we're still on track and on target. He talked about nuclear modernization and adding and adapting additional capabilities for escalation management. Well, that concept for the way the United States thinks about nuclear deterrence is the whole reason we have that concept of escalation management, et cetera, and adapting and increasing new capabilities is because of the extended deterrent that we provide our allies. That's why our nuclear posture is different than the French, which of course their nuclear posture is not designed to provide extended deterrence to the rest of the European continent. So I noticed that too. So that to me again shows that there's continuity there in on the hard power piece. And then of course Golden Dome still a priority, and that's going to require a lot of ally collaboration and cooperation. We still want Europeans and to buy more defense equipment, et cetera. So again, I would look to the real actionable things that make sense. I would really try these reporting, the reporting that comes out says there's another document that's going to have dramatic changes, or it's going to have a different architecture for dealing with. I just, I don't, I just try not to worry about the things that I just don't know anything about yet. So I would say that. But one more thing that I would just say about the public nature of talking about some of these civilizational things that I think is just important for context is previous administrations, Democrats also had their cultural issues that they cared about, that they tried to influence and impose upon the Europeans. We heard a lot about, when American domestic culture issues were flashpoints, we would see cabinet officials talk about their foreign policy implications. When Roe v. Wade was overturned, we heard about Secretary Yellen talking about how that would be bad for the United States' foreign policy on the world stage, et cetera. So I don't say that necessarily because it's going to allay people's concerns, but to provide some historical
Yeah.
context can kind of just say, like, look, this is not what's unprecedented is that it has a prominent place in a security document. I totally acknowledge that. But we've been here before on other hot button cultural issues where the United States tried, kind of took a stronger interest in domestic issues in Europe. The one thing I would just say that I am concerned about is even on the things that I think maybe Trump officials may be right in saying, controls on migration, et cetera, whatever the issue is, it's not going to even play necessarily the way they want it to with those groups in Europe who agree with them, because some of these groups are actually, they don't want to appear like they're listening to the United States, these far
Right.
right groups that are. So, the other kind of piece is like, this might be great for discussion and kind of forcing the conversation, but it may not necessarily sort of, have the same political, that it might not land sort of politically, even sort of best case scenario, the way people want it to here in Washington. So I am concerned about that as well. And furthermore, some of these some of these groups in Europe that may agree with the United States on the need to control their borders and migration, they're also against European rearmament, and they're pro-Russia. So there's some issues here that are, at cross purposes with U.S. security interests. Again, I would just say look to the concrete, actionable strategy things that we can actually do something with. And that, I think there is a lot of good and optimistic things in the study or in the report.
Yeah, that very good. I agree. There was a good piece in the I think it was today in the New York Times, a opinion piece talking exactly about the that this isn't new. That administrations in the past, Democrat and Republican, have tried to infuse some of the domestic issues. Culture wars at that time into our foreign policy. So you're right. It is not something that's new with Trump. But Nadia, do you have a view?
I think the question is, to what degree does political cohesion matter? And so we're debating these issues, but it's a matter of political cohesion and allies and partners. Generally, I think it matters. It doesn't have to be completely aligned. But I think in this particular alliance and NATO and the US-European relationship, I think there is this legitimate element of how political cohesion plays out. And I think part of this civilizational discussion is if the nature of countries in Europe shifts politically in dramatic ways, how does that impact the alliance? So again, I think we can have like mature discussions about that. And I think it's clear in here that it matters because the relationship with Europe is special. And this document says that several times. I mean, it says it pretty strongly. Not only can we not afford to write Europe off, doing so would be self-defeating for what this strategy aims to achieve. Okay, so the media just likes to pick up on the negative, on the stories, on they don't how many I could name 5 to 10 lines like this in the document. We're not talking about that because that's not interesting. That means, oh, gee, we are friends. We're just kind of we're having the ups and downs of a normal long term relationship. And, to the point of past administrations using these kinds of cultural issues. I mean, go back and read Build Back Better World. I mean, it's kook, like it's unbelievable. The amount of sort of cultural injection of the Biden ideology in there, and that wasn't a problem because, frankly, many European elites agreed with it, right? So here we're dealing with a problem because there's a discomfort to say we're comfortable with one set of ideas, but not a set of
Right.
other ideas.
Right.
So
One area where I feel like it's less comfortable though, and again, it maybe I'm reading this into it, but this insinuation or undertone that the United States should kind of intervene in European politics to quote unquote help Europe correct its current trajectory, or at the end of the strategy, it even says cultivate resistance to Europe's current trajectory.
Yes.
And so I think, for all of the kind of preamble language and not imposing US views and values on the rest of the world, we seem to make an exception for Europe. And I do think that Europeans are very uncomfortable with the idea that the US would somehow be intervening or cultivating resistance to their domestic politics. So how do you read that part of it? And again, like looking for actionable things, like what do you think the Trump administration is thinking? Like, how do you action that? Like, what is it that we would be doing to action to cultivate this resistance?
So I'll just take that. So one, I don't know.
yeah,
Again, I don't know. And so I try not to worry about tomorrow when I don't know what tomorrow holds. So that one. Now, if it were me, if this were like my national security strategy, my vision is that first of all, I would say this was I very sort of controversially in kind of the expert national security community during the first Trump administration really tried to push back on sort of progressive ideology being conflated with democracy, like as a foreign policy issue. Like I really pushed back hard on that. I said, look, like we're talking about NATO, but we like to be like in good standing with NATO, you have to do it's like climate stuff, and it's migration, it's Angela Merkel's specific vision for Germany, and this is just very controversial inside the United States, let alone sort of is this really what we are sort of as a shared alliance. So to Nadia's point, you do have to have some kind of, I mean, NATO is a political military alliance. We have to have some kind of cohesion over certain core ideas. And so I was really pushing back, it really should just be a few things: national sovereignty, rule of law, the dignity of the human person, meaning there's civil liberties there, et cetera, due process, very basic things. And then in my sort of dream American foreign policy, you have geopolitical pluralism in the free world. That because you have a democracy, France and Germany and Britain, that I don't have to worry about what you do domestically because I can entrust these things to you. But we have to agree on these core ideas, so that you do not have an American government sort of going right, going back and forth on issues that are important to their core constituencies. But again, that doesn't mean that some of the things that the Trump administration is bringing up right now aren't some core issues that I think we should have political alignment on, that I don't think should be partisan. I mean, free speech should not be something that's just like a henpecking issue for the US. Like that should be something that we all as open societies, democracies agree on. It makes us different than the authoritarian countries that are invading, Europe. That's what's different about Russia. Um, so I think I don't know what they mean, and so because there's no details and I don't know, it's just I don't know, but I do think it would be, from my perspective, I think the prudent thing is to say we're not. A lot of these discussions I do wish were had privately, because I like to sort of this idea in security documents. You want to be very clear about capturing the nature of the countries that are shared adversaries of ours, and you want to take a lighter touch, I think, to allies. But this is where we are, and it's a necessary conversation. And so I don't know exactly what some of the authors of the security strategy had in mind there.
yeah, I agree with. I mean, I don't know either. And one thing I've learned is not to try to read people's people's minds and to focus on the things we kind of can drive and can control. But I think that, fundamental to the European and U.S. disagreements now with in Trump 1 and in Trump 2 is a stubbornly different view of the role of the nation state. And this is something the Europeans cannot understand vis-a-vis Trump. And I think that President Trump and the White House also doesn't, that there's a sense of not understanding the full sense of why Europe is so resistant to the nation state concept, where it's deeply embedded in Europe that rise of the importance of the nation state is tied to a rise in nationalism, and it's tied to Germany in World War II. And the Europeans are just, there's just a huge resistance to that fundamental different view of how President Trump and his team sees the world and how they see the nation state as the main operating force in that world, and Europe does not. And this is a just perpetual disagreement. And I've had Europeans say to me, why would we want stronger nation states? Okay, and it's a different way of viewing the world.
Can I just piggyback on that real quick too? I was just in Berlin at the foreign policy forum that they had there too, and I was struck. And this is, of course, this forum was before the national security strategy came out, but I was struck, just to underscore Nadia's point that she just made, with these. One of the speakers on one of the panels was saying, "Look, Germans have to get more comfortable making arguments based on what is good for Germany." Like, this is a national. This is good. This is a pro-German. This is good for Germany. Like, even that is difficult for the sort of more center left or center right politicians. And you really, this is in the United States, it's true for in other open societies. If you do not have the more moderate voices being comfortable defending the sovereignty of the nation and what's good for the nation in a more prudent fashion, you're going to leave a vacuum open for the more extreme version of it. And this is what we're seeing. And so, and I will hear this, repeatedly from various ally, politicians from across the spectrum. There, a lot of what was in this report, I think there's a lot of politicians in Europe who would agree with it. They're just uncomfortable making those own arguments sort of domestically. So the
Right.
best way to head off American meddling is for these politicians to, really get courageous and start making these arguments themselves inside their own democracies.
If I could jump in real quick, Andrea, I agree with that. And I think what we're really seeing on display now with the pressure coming from Russia and potential Russian aggression over the next couple of years, as these nations are really having to do some self-examination on, are they ready? Like Germany particularly. Germany has said, it looks like we are gonna lead the defense of Europe. I think they've got the bit in their teeth on this, but there is this. Andrea, you said this too. They're still uncomfortable talking about it. That's what's happening in the UK right now too. There's a real drive within the UK pushing back on this idea that that nationalism is a bad thing. That you can't have your nation rise above the middle and actually become something of what it used to be. And so you're hearing that in the UK. You're hearing bits of it in France as well. So I think this one thing we're gonna see more of this over the next couple of years is this the Russians kind of uncorking this as every nation's starting to realize, we're in it. We're in it, and you can't turn to Brussels and say save us. That you're going to have to do it yourself. And I think that's what's going to really be interesting to watch in the coming
Yeah.
months.
I mean, but Jim, can I just make a point? So I don't think you can, and I don't think you said this, but this sparked a point in my mind that we also can't say that these discussions in Europe and saying the nation state is important and thinking about what it means to, to be a nation is a Russian influence operation. Like, you can legitimately talk about those issues,
Yep.
and you should be
Yep.
able to without many people saying, well, no, this is Russian influence decide to foment division in Europe or in France or in a country. I mean, It may be, but it may not be, and it's still a discussion that should be legitimate and not delegitimized by just calling it a Russian influence operation.
No, I agree. And yeah, just to make the point, that I was talking more about the fear in some nations that an aggressive Russia militarily, they might be facing that and they're not ready.
Yeah.
And it's now they're going to become they're going to get in some countries they're going to turn to a draft and this kind of thing, and suddenly nationalism is becoming more important because as they realize it's going to really be up to them to get themselves in a place where they can defend themselves and not turn to a European Union amorphous amoeba. That they've got to do it themselves, and that makes them more nationalistic, and it's more out of fear than anything else.
Yeah.
Maybe just to zoom out slightly from the national security strategy, there were a number of things kind of in the political environment around the same time as the strategy's release. And one thing that picked up some attention is this alleged reporting that US officials had told European counterparts that the United States wants to significantly downsize its role in NATO, which is not new. But the thing that was new was allegedly telling them by 2027, which is an incredibly, and I would say, unrealistic timeline for Europeans to be able to fill in some of these key gaps. And so I don't know if you have heard anything more about that, but when you step back, and Rebecca, you mentioned we still need to wait to see what the national defense strategy is. But how do you interpret now, giving this timeline to Europeans? Is it realistic, and what does it say about, again, where we are in the transatlantic relationship?
So I would just say, if I were European, I would look at this and I would take it seriously. So I would not sort of brush it off and say,
Bluster,
that's
yeah.
too, yeah, I would act as though it is, and I would take it very seriously. And by the way, you know, this is what it said is it wants Europe to take more on the conventional piece, so the non-nuclear piece. I think a very important piece of this that it is that the United States is going to maintain the backbone of security through the nuclear piece. So NATO remains a nuclear alliance, but the United States is the backbone of that. And it's infeasible for anybody, any nation, the Brits, the French, to replace the United States I think in my lifetime. I would even just say so, not knowing what my lifetime is. But I'm very skeptical just because of the nature of doctrines, and then also just what it required, the trust, the political maneuvering. It's too much. Only the United States can do that. We are the coalescing force. We are the nuclear superpower, and so we're going to provide that. And by the way, I was on the U.S. Strategic Posture Commission, one of the Republican appointed by Republican by Chairman Mike Rogers of the House Armed Services Committee for that bipartisan commission, and it was a bipartisan commission. It came out several years ago, and we said Europeans have to do more on conventional, not because of this notion of sort of freeloading, but because this is the first time in American history we have two nuclear peer powers that we're deterring. And so we need our allies to take on more of the conventional piece. And by the way, Secretary Hegseth said that at the Reagan Forum. He did not mention Russia and China by name, but he said this is the first time we have two nuclear peers we have to deter. So I was encouraged by that.
But see, the
So
fact that we need them to do it, I think everyone's on board. It's this timeline, 2027.
yeah, so I would
It's
just say
highly unrealistic.
it is unrealistic. I will say it's just technologically unrealistic because the United States provides things like ISR, the space based capabilities, early warning, radars, things that we actually have not wanted the Europeans to step in and do. We've provided that. And it's simply just going to take some time, sort of, technologically, for them to kind of take that on. And I think the United States, if we really, really want them to sort of take that on from us, we're going to have to look at some of our export controls and figure out if
Right.
there's things that we can re-examine and look at to offload to them. And so it's not just going to be sort of a crunch time for them. It's crunch time for us. And but again, I would take it seriously. I don't ever want to sort of take the heat off because I think the Europeans in the past have thought we just need to get through this until there's a different American presidency. That is a mistake. I think that you got to press forward and do this no matter what, because this is the first time we have two nuclear peers that are increasingly collaborating, not just to undermine the United States, but to undermine democratic alliances. So it's in all of our shared interests for the Europeans to get serious about their own conventional defense.
Yeah. And I would just add that, you know, this could be an example of taking something and creating an opportunity out of it would be to say, okay, if we're even trying to meet this timeline, however unrealistic it is, and it is, but for better or worse, governments rarely meet any timelines. So I mean, we can point to many problems in meeting timelines, but driving toward it, let's use the opportunity to shift at the export control regime, ITAR, FMS, to make those improvements. And
Yeah.
certainly this administration is totally behind that, right? If you went to the White House and if one of the next European leader that's in the White House should come, with specifics in hand about how long it takes to work through the American sort of regulatory regime in this whole domain and actually get the president's help to say enough is enough. We've been messing around with this for 20 years and it's a disaster. He could actually do something about it. His team could do something about it. So I would go in using that impetus toward a time frame to say let's move toward there, and to do
Yeah.
that we need to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And just so, and then on the to Rebecca's point about Russia, again, strategic stability with Russia, which is in the document, requires an incredibly strong deterrent posture, a serious deterrent posture, and that is a combination of the United States and Europe.
Yeah.
As we wrap up, so I think one of the things that all the transatlantic community is grappling with is we understand we're not going back to the way it was, where the United States kind of was the sole provider of European security. Europeans were very willing to kind of go along with US positions on certain things. There's going to be a new balance. And so if we are asking Europeans to do more, to provide more, to be more autonomous, do you also accept that from an American perspective that then we have to also be okay with a Europe that then might take positions that are different or at odds with where the United States might want to go on certain issues? I think that's going to be the crux of how far along this spectrum do we want to go? Do we want to turn it over entirely and say over to you Europeans and really accept that, we may part ways on key issues? Or how are you thinking about how we get this balance right?
Giving up control.
Yeah, no, I think that's part of it. That's part of the deal. The part of the deal of the United States being the dominant power and having so much responsibility is that we had much more influence. Whether or not the United States exercised that well or not, I think can be argued. But yes, of course, you're going to have the more other countries aren't reliant on the United States, the more they're going to be able to sort of exercise their own national objectives as they see them. But this is why I think we have to be prudent as Americans to say this is why I'm not comfortable with handing over the nuclear mission. This is why I'm not comfortable handing over SACEUR. I think it should be an American as SACEUR so that you don't because we have nuclear forces there and we want to be the ones that have control over that. So there's clearly going to be things where we say we have to be the ones as Americans because of our core interests in this region. This is what we still want to have. But on these other things, I don't know if accepting them. I expect Europeans as they get stronger to do things that we may not agree with. So I would expect the United States to push back where we can and have a little bit of tension there occasionally. But this is where I think people have sort of misunderstood the Trump approach towards authoritarian countries. Like it seems like he likes the Russians or he likes Xi Jinping or he likes Kim Jong-un. And honestly, it's like those countries are pushing back on him. And I think that there is a respect sometimes. You don't have to agree with it. I'm just trying to help understand it. That they're able to sort of push back. He calls them good deal makers or they're tough deal makers. And he has said this about allies. So, I could tell the Germans, I'm like, look, strong allies are good for the United States. They're going to be headaches sometimes, but weak allies are very dangerous for the United States. So if get it, the Germans, I'm like, get tourists into Ukraine. you start just doing things that you believe are in the interest of the security of Europe and the security of Germany, and maybe start doing things, and then you're going to have a a Washington that respects that and sort of then has to deal with you as a no kidding serious nation that's going to be doing things in your own perceived interests.
Last word is yours, Nadia. I'm aware of time.
I agree with Rebecca. I mean, President Trump and his team respect strength, and I think the Europeans coming to the table in with that strength, with a commitment to move forward on many of the points made in this document, will put the alliance in a stronger position, in my view. There's plenty to focus on in the document. To get us to a better place. And I think that it's clear about that. And I think we can do that if we go in with the right attitudes. So I'll end it there on that positive point. I mean, Andrea, to your earlier point, I mean, we've always had disagreements. We've had disagreements with allies. Like, there's always political disagreements, especially vis-a-vis the Middle East, Iran, Israel, European views on Palestine. I mean, we've had disagreements. The point here is, how do you basically ensure that the alliance overall remains a core focus of U.S. European interests, and actually backs up its statements with the military capabilities to deter Russia over the long term.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, this was a really wonderful conversation. Thank you both for taking the time to do it. Really fabulous, and really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to see you all.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.